Okay.
So I hope you're closing your contribution so that we permit
So then let me wind up so that the chair
Ledama to contribute,
yes,
and the chairperson of finance to reply.
So in summary, Mr. Speaker, the most important point why I really chose to contribute today is to ensure that we protect the legislative mandate of the Senate. That we should never cede to the National Assembly, because that will be violating clear provisions of the Constitution. If that is taken care of by Chair, Mr. Speaker, I'll be comfortable to support this proposed amendment, but with a caution that giving the government of the day a blank check on borrowing without Parliament acting as a check is a very dangerous route which we should not take. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Omogeni. Senator Ledama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to support this bill. I think it's important that we instill fiscal discipline in our management of public resources. Mr. Speaker, I was sitting down here and I was having a conversation with the chair of the Finance and Budget, and that's what made me actually contribute to these amendments. One of the things that made me feel very happy about this amendment is the fact that we are now defining the term parliament the way it ought to be defined. Parliament, the meaning of parliament, a lot of people out there would say parliament. And in that case, they would be referring to the lower house. But parliament is both houses. It is the Senate and the National Assembly. And the fact that you are now requiring anything that has to do with the public debt to be considered by both houses is something that you're beginning to recognize the importance of the county governments. Mr. Speaker, we talk about, one of the amendments talks about this issue of the debt ratio to the GDP. If you look at, anyone goes out there and Google currently and say what is the debt ratio to GDP for the country of Kenya, the figures that we have dates back to December 2022, which is at 67% of the debt ratio. Now, if this amendment, which is now being proposed, so that by the year 2027, the Cabinet Secretary in charge of Treasury would be able to lower this down to 55%, it is something that I can actually be able to support. And if you look at already, the figures that have been given and have been calculated by the committee, it has come down to 64.1%, which means there is a slight downward trend of about 3%. What is important, Mr. Speaker, is that as a country, we now have to learn on how to live within our means. Whenever I hear people talking about this bottom-up economics model, I actually tend to believe that none of them really understand what it is. It is just a beautiful phrase that you end up using it and you say, this is it. But the reality of it, if you go down and you define what that bottom-up should actually mean, it should be defined in a way that it creates employment, number one. It ensures that at least every county ensure a fiduciary responsibility. Earlier on, Mr. Speaker, we are debating, there was a statement which had been brought here about the issue a greater definition of pending bills contributes to the issue of public debt. Because if our counties, the management of resources in our counties do not ensure fiduciary responsibility, even to a greater extent, the discipline in the national government will continue plunging this country further into debt. We have serious crisis. And I hope that we don't just come here and we speak very good English, we define whatever we want to define. Like if you look at the Constitution as an example, this is a very interesting time. Nowadays, Mr. Speaker, you know, we read too much, such that our eyes get disrupted. That's why now we have to wear glasses. But if you look at the Constitution, the framers of the Constitution envision a situation where we ensure fiduciary responsibility, both in the national government and the county government. If you look at Article 211, Mr. Speaker, all the way down to Article 214, that talks about the public debt, borrowing. 211 talks about within 7 days, after either House of Parliament, we have no time for point of orders, we only have 5 minutes, you can talk later. Within 7 days after either House of Parliament so request by resolution, the Cabinet Secretary responsible for finance shall present